Let me tell you something that changed the way I look at every patient who walks through my door, and it's a truth that took me years of standing in emergency rooms to fully understand. The number of birthdays you've celebrated has almost nothing to do with the actual condition of your cells, your hormones, your brain, or your metabolism. There are two ages living inside every one of us. One is written on your driver's license. The other is written in your tissue, your blood chemistry, your mitochondria. And the space between those two numbers is shaped by three biological processes that begin picking up speed once you cross into your 14th year of life and keep accelerating from there. I've spent close to 2 decades working emergency medicine, and in that time I've treated somewhere close to 30 people on an average shift. That adds up to tens of thousands of human beings passing through my hands. And after enough years, patterns start to jump out at you whether you're looking for them or not. I think about 2 people I saw within the same month, years apart in the story, but similar in the lesson. One was a man past 70, alert, sharp-witted, handling his own prescriptions, living entirely on his own terms. He came in for something minor, we sorted it, and he walked back out into his life. The other was a woman, not yet 60, who had cycled through our doors 4 separate times that same month, juggling a dozen different medications, moving through the world with the physical capability of someone 20 years or senior. Genetics play a role in stories like these, and life throws curveballs nobody can fully control. But more often than not, what separates these 2 people is decades of biological processes that were either allowed to compound against them or were kept in check. That's what I want to unpack with you today. 3 forces that quietly accelerate aging once you pass 40, and what you can actually do about each one. The first thing most people notice is their energy draining away. I'm not talking about the kind of tiredness that follows a rough night of sleep. This runs deeper than that. It's a fatigue that stops being the exception and starts becoming the baseline. Getting through an ordinary Tuesday suddenly costs more than it used to. You used to grind through a brutal week and bounce back by the weekend. Now that exhaustion follows you into the next week, and sometimes the one after. It settles into your bones in a way rest doesn't seem to touch anymore. The data on self-reported energy backs this up clearly. Researchers tracking energy levels across populations consistently find a noticeable dip beginning in the mid-40s. It isn't sudden or dramatic. It's a slow erosion. But stretch that erosion across 10 years, and plenty of people in their 50s describe feeling like an entirely different person than they were at 35, even though nothing catastrophic happened to them. The second shift people notice shows up in their bodies. Strength fades. Simple household tasks start requiring real effort. Carrying groceries up a flight of stairs, getting down on the floor to play with a grandchild, pushing yourself up out of a low couch without using your arms. These small physical acts start demanding more than they once did. And this matters more than most people realize because physical capability isn't just about how strong you feel at the gym. It's tightly linked to independence, to confidence, to the entire texture of your daily life. There's a simple measurement called grip strength that researchers rely on as a stand-in for overall physical function. And study after study shows that weak grip strength in midlife is one of the strongest predictors of disability and mortality decades down the road. It isn't that your grip itself holds some magical power. It's that it reflects something true about the underlying condition of your whole body. The third pattern, and honestly the one I think deserves the most attention, is what I describe as a staircase decline. Aging rarely moves in a smooth, gradual line. It moves in drops, like descending a staircase one step at a time. Something happens, an illness, an injury, a stretch of relentless stress from work or family or finances, and you never quite climb back to where you stood before. That drop becomes your new floor. Then the next disruptive event drops you again. Picture a torn ligament in your leg that sidelines you from movement for 6 weeks. You lose muscle. You put on some weight. You feel less steady on your feet, so you move even less. Your mood dips, so your eating habits slip too. Suddenly you're inhabiting a completely different body than the one you had 2 months earlier. Not because of some inevitable aging clock, but because a chain of events compounded on top of each other. Once you've spent enough time in clinical practice watching this play out again and again, you cannot unsee it. So here's the real question worth asking. It isn't what triggers these drops, because we already know the answer. Injuries, illness, stress. These are simply part of being alive and always will be. The real mystery is why. Once you cross 40, those same disruptions start leaving permanent marks they never used to leave. Why does recovery slow down? Why does the baseline shift lower instead of resetting back to normal? Why does a body that used to absorb a setback and spring back now absorb the same setback and just stay there? Underneath every one of these steps downward, three biological processes are quietly eroding your body's capacity to bounce back. And once you understand what they are, the whole picture snaps into focus. Start with your mitochondria, the tiny engines inside every cell of your body responsible for converting fuel into usable energy. Every cell you have, muscle, heart, brain, all of it depends on these structures functioning properly. As the years pass, two things happen simultaneously. You generate fewer of them, and the ones you still have become less efficient at their job. The result is less energy produced at the cellular level, which translates into slower recovery after physical exertion and a persistent fatigue that can't be pinned on any single obvious cause. It's simply the quiet hum of a system running below capacity. Scientists call this mitochondrial dysfunction, and it sits at the very top of a landmark body of research identifying the core biological drivers behind aging, first published over a decade ago and continually refined since. This isn't fringe theory. It's central to how the scientific community understands why bodies age the way they do. Here's the part that matters most, though. While mitochondrial decline happens naturally with age, how you live dramatically speeds it up or slows it down. Long stretches of sitting accelerated. Diets built around heavily processed food accelerated. Chronic stress and poor sleep accelerated too. People who feel utterly depleted in their 50s, who feel like they aged a decade in the span of 2 years, often aren't simply getting older. They're aging inside a daily routine that's actively assaulting their mitochondria. There's another layer worth knowing. As mitochondria accumulate, where through a process called oxidative stress, where the natural byproducts of energy production cause cellular damage over time, they start triggering inflammation throughout the body. So mitochondrial decline doesn't just sap your energy. It actively fuels the other forces driving accelerated aging. The encouraging news is that mitochondria respond to exercise in ways almost nothing else in biology can match. Sustained cardiovascular activity triggers something called mitochondrial biogenesis, where your body literally manufactures new mitochondria in response to the demand you place on it. Resistance training, whether with weights or body weight movements, improves the efficiency of the mitochondria already present in your muscle tissue. This is one of those rare instances in human biology where meaningful reversal is genuinely possible. Now let's talk about the hormonal shift, because after 40, your internal chemistry changes in ways that touch nearly every function in your body. Testosterone is the most commonly discussed hormone, relevant to both men and women in different ways. In men, it peaks in the late teens and early 20s, then begins declining roughly 1 to 2% annually starting in the mid-30s. By the late 50s, a man might be operating with 30 to 40% less testosterone than he had at his peak. That decline touches muscle growth, bone density, mood, motivation, and recovery for physical exertion. In women, the picture involves its own complexity. Testosterone declines here too, but the more dramatic shift is the drop in estrogen and progesterone through the transition into menopause, typically landing between the mid-40s and early 50s, though it can start earlier for plenty of women, and that's entirely within the range of normal. Estrogen offers protective effects for the heart, bones, brain function, and metabolic health. When it drops, women often experience rapid shifts in body composition, sleep, mood, and energy that can feel abrupt and disorienting. Then there's insulin resistance, where cells gradually stop responding properly to insulin's signal to absorb glucose from the bloodstream. This worsens steadily with age and gets significantly compounded by inactivity, excess fat around internal organs, poor sleep, and chronic stress. As resistance builds, your body compensates by producing more insulin. Energy becomes less stable, post-meal crashes get sharper, and fat accumulates more readily, especially around the midsection. Left unaddressed, this pathway leads toward prediabetes and type 2 diabetes, each carrying its own cascade of complications. And then there's cortisol, arguably the most overlooked hormone in this entire conversation. Cortisol is your primary stress hormone, and it isn't inherently harmful. It gets you out of bed and helps you respond to life's demands. But in midlife, when responsibilities pile up, when sleep gets shorter, when financial pressure mounts, when you're caring for aging parents while still raising your own children, cortisol tends to run chronically elevated. And chronically high cortisol does something very specific. It breaks down muscle tissue, promotes fat storage around your organs, and suppresses immune function in ways that slow recovery and increase vulnerability to illness. This hormonal shift after 40 isn't just about feeling worn down or losing muscle tone. It's a fundamental change in the chemical environment your entire body operates within. You cannot stop testosterone from declining. You cannot stop menopause from arriving. But you absolutely can influence how quickly insulin resistance develops, how high your cortisol runs, and how fast you lose muscle. Resistance training stands as the most well-supported intervention for hormonal health in midlife, full stop. It improves insulin sensitivity, supports healthy testosterone levels, and blunts the muscle-damaging effects of cortisol. The third driver is chronic inflammation, and this one deserves special attention because it's the least understood of the three and possibly the most consequential. When people hear the word inflammation, they picture something visible, a swollen joint, a sore throat, warmth radiating from a healing wound. That's acute inflammation, short-lived and useful. Your immune system doing exactly what it's designed to do. What we're discussing here is entirely different. Long-term, low-grade inflammation, sometimes called inflammaging in research circles because it maps so closely onto the aging process itself, produces no obvious symptoms. You can't feel it directly, but it shows up clearly in blood work through markers like C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, and its downstream consequences are massive. Chronic inflammation is now recognized as a central driver behind nearly every major age-related disease: cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, Alzheimer's, cancer, autoimmune conditions. Several familiar culprits feed it. Visceral fat, the fat surrounding your internal organs rather than sitting under your skin, is metabolically active in ways most people don't appreciate, continuously releasing inflammatory molecules called cytokines into your bloodstream. Ultra-processed food drives inflammation through multiple pathways, disrupting the gut microbiome and spiking blood sugar. Poor sleep is another major contributor. Even 1 or 2 nights of significantly disrupted rest produces measurable spikes in inflammatory markers. Chronic stress activates inflammatory pathways through cortisol. And alcohol, rarely discussed in this context but deserving far more attention, drives all three processes simultaneously. It impairs mitochondrial function, disrupts hormonal balance, and elevates inflammatory markers in ways that build up with regular use, even something as ordinary as a nightly glass of wine. Chronic inflammation makes everything slower: recovery from exercise, recovery from illness, tissue repair. It fuels joint pain many people mistake for simple wear and tear. It worsens insulin resistance and accelerates muscle loss. There's a concept researchers call the inflammatory threshold. Everyone carries a baseline level of inflammation, and as long as it stays under a certain point, the body manages it well. But that baseline tends to climb with age, and once it crosses a critical point, decline accelerates across multiple systems simultaneously. Let's talk about muscle, because most people think of it purely in terms of appearance or gym performance, when in reality muscle functions as one of the most important organs in the entire body for long-term health. Muscle tissue serves as your body's primary glucose disposal site, absorbing the majority of carbohydrates you consume and converting them into usable energy. Strong muscle mass, even well into your 80s or 90s, keeps blood sugar well regulated and insulin sensitivity high. Lose muscle and blood sugar control deteriorates. Insulin resistance worsens, and your entire metabolic environment declines. But there's more to the story. When muscle contracts, it produces signaling molecules called myokines, chemical messengers sent throughout the body. Some instruct the brain to grow new cells. Some reduce inflammation. Some improve heart and liver function. One particular myokine, irisin, has been shown across the blood-brain barrier and directly support cognitive function. This is why skeletal muscle is now understood as an endocrine organ in its own right, actively regulating the rest of the body through the chemicals it releases. Muscle loss, clinically termed sarcopenia, typically begins in your 30s and accelerates sharply after 50, with people losing somewhere between 3 and 8% of muscle mass per decade without deliberate intervention, and some research suggests that figure may be even higher. By the 70s, that cumulative loss can be severe enough to affect someone's ability to rise from a floor or climb a flight of stairs. But the downstream damage begins long before that point. Less muscle means less glucose absorption, more insulin resistance, more inflammation, fewer protective myokines, and a steadily worsening metabolic picture. And here's what makes this urgent. The hormonal shifts of midlife, falling testosterone, rising cortisol, actively accelerate muscle loss. Chronic inflammation accelerates muscle loss. Mitochondrial decline reduces the energy available for muscle repair. These three processes aren't running in isolation. They're all converging on your muscles simultaneously, which makes protecting it one of the central tasks of aging well. Your brain deserves just as much attention because people tend to imagine physical aging and cognitive aging as separate journeys, when the biology tells a different story entirely. The same three processes, mitochondrial decline, hormonal shifts, and chronic inflammation, are also the primary drivers of brain aging. Anything affecting your body below the neck affects your brain as well. Your brain is remarkably energy hungry, accounting for roughly 2% of body weight, while consuming around 20% of total energy, all of it produced by mitochondria. When mitochondrial function declines, the brain feels it acutely through brain fog, slower thinking, difficulty concentrating, and misplacing things more often than you used to. Chronic inflammation does something particularly damaging here, too. The brain has specialized immune cells called microglia responsible for clearing damage and protecting neural tissue. When systemic inflammation runs chronically high, driven by visceral fat, poor sleep, and processed food, these cells become overactivated, producing their own inflammatory signals in a process called neuroinflammation, now understood as a central mechanism behind Alzheimer's and other forms of dementia. The amyloid plaques visible in the brains of people with Alzheimer's aren't necessarily the starting point. They're partly a consequence of a brain that's been chronically inflamed for years. Estrogen carries protective effects for brain function, and its decline during menopause is associated with increased risk of cognitive decline. One reason there's growing research interest in the timing of hormone therapy relative to menopause onset. Testosterone supports cognitive function too, particularly spatial reasoning and memory. And chronically elevated cortisol has been shown to directly damage the hippocampus, the brain structure most responsible for forming new memories. Chronic stress isn't just making you feel bad. It's physically shrinking one of your brain's most vital structures. Exercise remains the only intervention with strong, consistent evidence for reducing dementia risk, not a supplement, not a medication. Aerobic activity stimulates production of brain-derived neurotrophic factor, a molecule that acts like fertilizer for brain cells, supporting new neuron growth and strengthening existing connections while directly counteracting neuroinflammation. Resistance training improves insulin sensitivity within brain tissue itself, and irisin, produced through muscle contraction, crosses the blood-brain barrier and directly boosts that same neurotrophic factor. The physical and the cognitive aren't separate tracks. They're the same track, and working on one strengthens the other. What makes all of this matter so profoundly is that these three processes don't operate in parallel. They feed each other, amplify each other, and once you see the feedback loop clearly, the speed at which people can decline within a short window stops feeling mysterious. Mitochondrial dysfunction promotes inflammation. Inflammation worsens insulin resistance. Insulin resistance disrupts hormonal balance. Poor hormonal balance accelerates muscle loss. Less muscle means less glucose absorption, more insulin resistance, fewer protective myokines, and a steadily deteriorating metabolic environment. The cycle keeps turning, gathering speed as it goes. Researchers call this biological aging, the rate at which your body accumulates damage and dysfunction, distinct from chronological aging, which simply counts the years you've been alive. One of the most significant findings in aging science over the past 2 decades is just how far these two ages can diverge. There are people in their 50s carrying the biological profile of someone in their late 60s or 70s, and people in their 70s with the biological markers of someone 15 years younger. The difference, research consistently shows, comes down almost entirely to lifestyle. People whose biology runs younger than their years tend to move consistently, eat mostly whole foods, sleep adequately, manage stress, and maintain strong social connections. They aren't the people relying on supplements. It isn't glamorous. It's the unglamorous fundamentals, practiced consistently over years, that make the real difference. One factor that rarely gets discussed in conversations about aging is the loss of purpose and daily structure. There's substantial longitudinal research showing that retirement, when it arrives alongside a significant drop in daily activity and social engagement, correlates with steep declines in physical and cognitive function that go well beyond what age alone would predict. This isn't true of everyone who retires, only those who don't replace that structure with something else engaging. Research into populations that live unusually long, healthy lives consistently finds that a strong sense of purpose ranks among the most powerful predictors of longevity. Not supplements, not any particular food, simply a reason to get up each morning. Closely tied to this is social connection, which carries its own independent biological weight. Loneliness and isolation raise inflammatory markers, disrupt cortisol regulation, and predict early mortality at rates researchers have compared to smoking over a pack of cigarettes daily. When people stay socially connected, they tend to move more, eat more regularly, carry less background stress, and sleep better. Removing that connection strips away a layer of biological protection that turns out to matter enormously. Though if someone genuinely feels content living a quieter, more solitary life without loneliness, that's an entirely different situation and not something to worry over. Reduced daily movement is another major accelerant, and it operates more subtly than people realize. Research into non-exercise activity, the energy burned through everyday movement that isn't formal exercise, things like climbing stairs, standing, bending to pick something up, shows it can account for up to 1,000 calories of difference per day between sedentary and active people. Modern conveniences, cars, elevators, desk jobs, food delivery, streaming services have systematically stripped movement out of daily life. Research on prolonged sitting as an independent risk factor for mortality, separate from formal exercise habits, is genuinely striking. People who exercise regularly but then sit for 10 hours a day still carry significantly elevated cardiovascular risk. It isn't the missing gym session that ages people fastest. It's the absence of 1,000 small movements that used to naturally fill an ordinary day. This connects directly to the problem of recovery from illness and injury. Every significant health event, a serious infection, a hospital stay, major surgery, causes fitness, muscle mass, and cardiovascular capacity to drop, and if full recovery doesn't happen, which becomes harder with age, those losses accumulate. You don't simply age. You age plus the compounded weight of everything you never fully recovered from. The single most powerful protective measure is entering each of these events as fit, strong, and metabolically healthy as possible, because the more reserve capacity you carry, the less each setback takes from you. Sleep deserves its own spotlight, because it remains undervalued even among people who otherwise take their health seriously. Sleep isn't a passive state. It's when your body performs the bulk of its repair work. Growth hormone, largely responsible for muscle repair and fat metabolism, releases predominantly during sleep. Your brain clears metabolic waste through a system that functions properly mainly at night. Your immune system consolidates its responses. Your cortisol rhythm resets, and insulin sensitivity is profoundly shaped by sleep quality, with even a single poor night measurably impairing blood sugar regulation the following day. Sleep architecture shifts with age too, with less time spent in deep restorative stages and hormonal changes, particularly declining progesterone in women and testosterone in men, directly affect sleep quality. Combined with the noise and stress of midlife responsibilities, this creates a cruel irony. The exact period when the body most needs high-quality sleep is also the period when sleep quality tends to decline the most. Finally, there's diet, and specifically protein, a piece that rarely gets enough attention in conversations about aging. As you get older, something called anabolic resistance develops, where muscle tissue becomes less responsive to protein's signal to build and repair itself. Practically speaking, this means you need more protein past 40 than you did at 25 to maintain or build muscle, with current research in sports nutrition pointing toward somewhere between roughly 1.6 and 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight daily for active people in midlife, notably higher than standard dietary guidelines suggest. Spreading that intake across meals matters too, since the body can only effectively use somewhere around 30 to 40 grams of protein for muscle building at any single sitting. Beyond protein, the broader pattern of whole foods over heavily processed ones directly reduces the background inflammatory load, quietly slowing recovery, metabolism, and brain function. The practical goal isn't perfection. It's making sure the bulk of what you eat, most of the time, comes from food that doesn't carry a long list of unfamiliar preservatives and additives. There's an important distinction worth closing on. Normal aging looks like gradual, manageable decline paired with maintained independence, a slower pace of life, but a stable one. Research on populations that age particularly well, in places like Okinawa and Sardinia, shows that most people in reasonably healthy environments can remain physically capable and mentally sharp well into their 70s, 80s, and even 90s. That isn't what large parts of the modern Western world are experiencing, where people are becoming functionally old in their 50s, carrying chronic fatigue, significant muscle loss, and overlapping health conditions that interfere with the basic demands of daily life. That gap between what aging should look like and what it actually looks like for so many people comes down, more often than not, to lifestyle, though genetics, unavoidable illness, and socioeconomic circumstances all play their part too. Aging itself is inevitable, and anyone claiming to have found a way to stop it entirely is selling you something. Hormones will shift. Mitochondria will grow less efficient. Muscle will demand more deliberate effort to maintain. The brain will need more active protection than it once did. That's simply biology, and the sooner you make peace with that reality, the better positioned you are to work with it rather than against it. But rapid decline, the kind explored throughout this conversation, is not something you're required to accept. The idea that every illness or injury leaves you permanently worse off, never quite returning to where you stood before, is not an inevitability. The goal was never to halt aging altogether. The goal is protecting your baseline, recovering quickly when life knocks you down, and maintaining enough reserve capacity that each setback costs you less. Progressive resistance training, performed 2 or 3 times weekly, stands as the closest thing available to a direct countermeasure against all 3 processes we've explored today. Building and preserving muscle as you age matters immensely, because that tissue functions as a biological asset, regulating metabolism, controlling blood sugar, reducing inflammation, and sending protective signals to the brain with every contraction. Daily movement, simply staying active and avoiding long stretches of sitting, maintains cardiovascular capacity and metabolic health. Protein spread thoughtfully across your meals supplies the raw material your body needs to hold onto muscle despite anabolic resistance. Sleep, treated as a genuine physiological priority rather than a luxury, regulates every hormone tied to recovery, body composition, immune function, and cognitive health. Whole foods, overprocessed ones, quiet the background inflammation, slowing everything down. And purpose, something that structures your days and keeps you connected to the people around you, turns out to carry biological weight that research is only now beginning to fully map. None of this amounts to secret protocols or hidden biohacks. These are simply the fundamentals, and they happen to directly address mitochondrial function, hormonal balance, chronic inflammation, muscle preservation, and brain health because that's precisely what the human body was built to need. Aging doesn't arrive all at once. It chips away slowly, quietly, one small choice at a time. And the people who navigate it well aren't the ones chasing some hidden secret. They're simply the ones who understood exactly what they were protecting and built their daily lives around protecting it.